This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Welcome to DBrief, the podcast that explains industry to policymakers and government policy to industry, and is driven by the Australian Industry Group's mission, which is to empower industry success for a better Australia. My name is Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy at the Australian Industry Group, and this week I'm joined all the way from Brazil by Tennant, Director for Climate and Energy. Welcome, Tennant.
Hola.
Now, Tennant, you're calling us from Brazil, where you're attending COP30, but with all the noise happening over the other side of the world, there is a lot of energy being spent in Australia on a whole range of climate and energy issues, but one in particular is EPBC reform. Give us the headlines. Why do we care about this, and what is our group's position?
So the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act is the national legislation that governs approvals or assessments of major projects that might have a national environmental impact. And nobody likes this law. It's been in place for more than 20 years. It's slow, it's cumbersome, it's unpredictable, and it's not doing a very effective job of protecting the environment. So for 5 years, there has been a broad view, supported originally by a review of the Act conducted by former ACCC head Graham Samuel, that major surgery was needed to the Act to streamline it while strengthening environmental protection. There's been a few goes at that have not acquired sufficient political consensus to move ahead. And what's now proposed by the current federal government is its second attempt at this, and it would aim to streamline the existing pathways for projects to be assessed and provide faster maximum times for decisions to be made in. It would try to make it more common to have landscape-wide assessments of things like major housing growth zones or renewable energy zones, so that individual projects can then just get approved in a simple way to participate in that zone, rather than doing 50 separate parallel yet identical consideration processes. And there's a lot else in there, including actually the glittering prize of an eventual single touch approval process, because the states do environmental approvals as well. And the powers that are in this legislation are meant to enable a future where the federal government can set out some national standards for what is adequate environment protection, and then accredit, say, New South Wales to do the approvals on their behalf for matters governing one of those standards. That would be great to get to. It's going to take us a little while to get to that, but the legislation would be the basis for getting there.
And I think that glittering dream of a single economic market, a single certification process, is what fuels you and I, Tennant, in supporting this bill and trying to work hard to get others along for the ride. It was the inquiry, the Senate inquiry was meant to report in February, but I think things are moving at such a pace, perhaps there might be a conclusion by the end of Parliament, which is next week. Perhaps.
Yeah, things could move very fast. And so if there are improvements to be made, there's not a lot of time to do those and to analyse what is a very large and complex amendments to an already very large and complex act. And the Australian Industry Group has had previews before it was introduced to the Parliament of a lot of these changes. And we've put the detail out to members. We're getting views, but it's all accelerating so much. So it's going to be a hairy week or two.
Yes. Anyway, what's perhaps not moving as quickly are the negotiations at COP. Now, in your LinkedIn posts, you talk about the big four, and I recommend anyone listening to, if they don't already follow Tennant on LinkedIn, do so. What are the big four issues that are covered?
Okay, so there is always a huge agenda to work through at these UN climate conferences, but often the conferences get off to a really difficult start because there's a fight about actually what should be on the agenda. And this year, there were some really curly issues that parties disagreed with each other strongly about that were proposed to be included in the agenda, and the Brazilian presidency very neatly avoided an agenda fight that held up the whole work of the conference for a day or two by saying they would hive off these 4 difficult issues into a special set of discussions about how and whether they should be discussed at all. And these are being referred to by many as the Big Four, and they are, in some ways, very technical, but it comes down to money, confidence, and trade. So the Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement is a piece of the finance of it all. And this is the bit about how there is a responsibility of developed countries to provide support to developing countries to address climate change. And there's a view from many, many developing countries that this is not only not being done, but it has been sidelined in the previous negotiations about finance, which were about about loans, about multilateral development bank finance, and about leveraging private finance. So developing, many of them say, this must be on the topic and we must have $1 trillion of no strings attached public finance, grants, and of course, developed countries very wary of that. The second one is the state of what's called the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. These are more or less the targets that countries themselves decide on. Nobody tells Australia what our target must be. We decide that. And the same is true of China, of India. The question here is, we haven't got all of the new round of targets yet, but we've got a lot. They don't add up to enough to meet the global goal of limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. They do substantially move the needle on how much climate change we can expect, but not by enough. So what are we going to do about that? And developed countries broadly say, this is a huge issue. We need to focus on this. Developing countries tend to say, not all of them, there are divisions here, but tend to say, well, it's very hard to talk about that if we're not talking about provision of the means of implementation, aka Article 9.1, aka cash. There's a third one, which is BTR, with just bad acronyms all the way, which is Biennial Transparency Review, which is just another aspect of how are we tracking and what does that add up to and what do we have to do. And then the final thing is UTMs, unilateral trade measures, which is what developing countries refer to the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism in particular as, but they have other things in mind like green industrial policy as well. They're very worried, they say, about the impacts of these policies on them. The European Union prefers to speak about climate policies with cross-border implications. They don't like the word unilateral at all. And so the presidency, Brazil is running these negotiations, and I have to say they are doing a very smooth and effective job of it. They are great diplomats as far as I can see. And there is, to your point, Louise, about is it moving slower than the federal parliament? Actually, there is a surprising possibility that the main difficult issues in this conference may be resolved in the next 24 hours as we record.
Fantastic.
Which would be unprecedented. So as we record, it is here in Brazil. It is Tuesday. The conference is meant to conclude on Friday. These conferences usually spill over into the weekend, sometimes as late as mid-afternoon on the Sunday. The Brazilian presidency has sworn up and down in a meeting this afternoon with all the heads of delegation of all the nations represented here that they intend to conclude these political issues on Wednesday afternoon. Now, we will see if that happens. Other presidencies have had ambitions similar to that, but the feeling in the room is quite positive. The divisions on some of these issues are high, but I think we may see an outcome. If we do, it won't be the end of any of those issues. It will be the start, in some ways, of fuller discussion of the role of trade and the intersection of trade and climate, and of how we progress both the private and the public finance parts of a climate response.
Well, let's talk a bit more about the finance. As you say, it's becoming one of the biggest sticking points at this COP. Are there any innovative mechanisms? Are people thinking of new and imaginative ways to address the issue, to unlock these billions that are needed for the adoption and mitigation?
Yeah, so there is innovation and there is very old thinking as well. And everybody has their case to make and their story to tell. Last year at Baku in Azerbaijan, the big contentious item was what's called the new collective quantified goal, which is a number and a description of what counts to that number for finance to developing countries to help them with both reducing emissions and with adapting to the amount of climate change that we're not going to avoid. And that was hugely controversial in the end, and involved a tripling of the existing goal for climate finance, which was goes back to the Obama presidency as a proposal, and then it was met according to developed countries, but developing countries say it wasn't met 3 years ago, scaling finance to $100 billion per year, counting a broad range of sources, including development finance from the World Bank and so on. The new goal last year was to triple that to $300 billion per year by 2035, and to scale up private finance, a broader range of sources, to hit $1.3 trillion per year over that time. And so there have been a few things going on since then. One is the construction of what's called the Baku to Belém roadmap, because we love a roadmap in this process, to explain or explore how the 300 turns into 1.3 trillion. And alongside that discussion, this fight about Article 9.1, which is about government-to-government grants, is the ask. And so private finance obviously has to play an enormous role, and can, because for the mitigation, the emissions reducing part of things, a lot of that will just be quite commercial activity. Like renewable energy is in many places the cheapest way to add new megawatt hours. There are complexities that come with absorbing that variable renewable supply, but a lot of it is super commercial, and it's a question of scaling up the availability of capital and lowering the cost of that capital to many developing countries. There is also discussion about operationalizing what's called Article 6, which is the international carbon markets enabling piece of the Paris Agreement. The rule book for this was finished a couple of years ago, and activity is just in the process of starting. But of course, there's still the administration of this system of crediting activities like reforestation or the deployment of innovative low carbon technologies. There's a lot of implementation to be done, and a big question mark over which countries. There's plenty of countries that say we can do more abatement if somebody will support us to do so through Article 6 by buying credits. There's not a lot of countries yet saying they will buy these credits. And there's going to be a question mark over who's coming forward, including will Australia find some way to be a customer for these credits, or do we want to sell them?
Yeah, well, I mean, all the debate of the finance, I mean, everything ultimately comes to money. But before we decide on the finance, we really need to work out where we're going to get to. And if 1.5 degrees is still in debate and many negotiators questioning whether it's still achievable, what should the global community do? Should it double down on ambition or recalibrate expectations? And fundamentally, what does it mean for industry?
So this is a gargantuan question, and it is not going to be resolved this year at Berlin. The science is pretty clear that the available carbon budget to stay within 1.5 degrees without what's called an overshoot, which is where temperatures exceed 1.5 degrees, but then you claw your way back down by hauling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through reforestation or through what's called direct air capture, huge complexes of fans sucking air past solvents and sorbents to remove the carbon dioxide from it and liquefy that and pump it deep underground. That sounds expensive, and it is. If we're not going to do an overshoot, then we have spent globally nearly all of the carbon budget, the amount of emissions that the world can put up into the atmosphere that's consistent with that 1.5 degrees. And very few people think that globally we will now cut emissions fast enough to stay within that budget without an overshoot. So as you say, Louise, that raises huge questions. What do we do in the light of that? Now, whoever will come to this, I guess, but whoever hosts COP in 2026 may have to preside over more grappling with what this means. But broadly, the options are, and the implications for industry are, you could accept an overshoot and say that overshoot, and the Secretary General of the UN was saying this just a couple of weeks ago, we should ensure that overshoot is as low and as short in duration as possible, which still means lots of rapid emissions reductions in all areas of the economy where that is feasible, and lots of negative emissions from forests and land and engineering wherever that is feasible. And that means that for business, very similar trajectory in terms of emissions reductions and the pressure for that in the near term. Eventually, major costs and major opportunities for someone around delivering all that negative emissions, and on the way through, higher physical impacts and financial impacts on assets, on employees, on customers from a higher level of climate change. That last point is true even more so for the next option, which is just to accept a higher level of climate change than 1.5 degrees. That is in some ways more plausible than inventing a new global negative emissions industry that is the size of the global aluminium sector, but has no saleable product but what somebody will pay to take carbon out of the atmosphere. But we should not underestimate how serious the consequences for many economies are of higher levels of global warming. And indeed, for some economies, for some countries, they are simply existential. The human race will not go extinct. with 2.5, 3 degrees of global warming. But most of the Pacific Island nations will cease to exist within the 21st century, at least in any recognisable form under those higher levels. And in fact, in the long term, sea level rise well beyond the 21st century would very severely impact all of the near the coast property and assets in the world. If we sometimes fixate on the numbers for sea level rise that are very firmly expected in the next couple of decades, which are in the order of tens of centimetres, maybe 50 to 100 centimetres by the end of this century. However, that's just based on numbers for the thermal expansion of the oceans as they get hotter. The big swing factor here is how fast do the huge land ice stores in Antarctica and Greenland melt. And in terms of that's a slow process, we think, but one that can also become chaotically accelerated, not well understood. And just for context, in the deep past, sea levels on Earth have been up to 200 metres higher than they are today. So that's a lot more than losing beachfront. That's losing most of Melbourne, for example. Not going to happen within the 21st century, we think. Not something that you could stop easily once it's really set in motion. So finally, I should say, the final option here, and there's no good options, they're all a bit horrible, is what's called by some geoengineering, by others climate intervention, or climate chemotherapy might be more accurate, which is the idea of while we're trying to cut emissions and then take atmospheric concentrations back down below the level consistent with 1.5 degrees, what if you intervene to lower temperatures by blocking out the sun just a little bit? By spraying sulfate aerosol particles or other substances into the upper stratosphere. Now, that makes some people think of cane toads to fight cane beetles.
It honestly sounds like a horror movie.
Yes. But this is something that is going to be discussed more, or it's one of the options anyway. Sounds pretty mad scientisty. There are certainly things that can go wrong, but like 2 degrees of warming, also not so good. So we'll see. Maybe that's a 2026 conversation.
Yes. Well, anyway, on that sober note, we'll just take a break. We'll come back and think about what private sector's role will be in this.
The largest Australian workplace changes in over a decade
Underpaying
are about
workers
to impact
could
your
result
business.
in crippling fines.
There'll be new rules about when a casual employee
The laws are
has the right
employees will have the right
to disconnect.
Workplace laws are changing. Pay attention or pay the price. Safeguard your business with Australian Industry Group. The legal experts at Australian Industry Group will help you navigate the new legislation and prepare your business for the changes. Become a member today at aigroup.com.au.
And we're back talking with Tennant from COP in Brazil and about the negotiations and what it means for industry. So, Tennant, as you said earlier, Brazil has executed their hosting duties very, very well. I mean, of course, they had G20, B20 just last year, and we have a long relationship with the Industry Association in Brazil. And they've worked with us throughout the year on using a sort of a B20 model of getting ideas, coalescing around certain themes so that you arrive at COP as a business community ready to discuss, what can happen. But given that this is UN and there's a lot of government negotiators and industry can feel a bit disconnected from COP and what it means, what can it mean, for industry? And moreover, based on the discussions we just had, how can businesses balance competitiveness with sustainability in the race to net zero, and what lessons are emerging from COP30's private sector dialogues?
So I think there is a lot for business to learn and to contribute in this process. It can be hard for the business voice to be heard because there's more than 190 nations who are the primary participants in this process. But they themselves are increasingly recognising that it is people outside of governments and particularly business and industry that are the essential partners in actually doing the industrial decarbonisation, the transformation of energy systems, the building of new markets and the transition of old markets that is contemplated by the government and political players. And so through the what's called this year the SB COP, the Sustainable Business COP, stewarded by the Brazilian Confederation of National Industry, or through the what's called the BINGO process, the Business and Industry Non-Government Organisation Observer Constituency, which gets a chance to speak directly to the negotiators at select points throughout the process. I've been lucky enough to make those statements a couple of times so far this COP on behalf of global business, but there are people from many national business federations present here at the COP. It is important to make those views known because the decisions that are made here ultimately do flow through. Of course, the UN doesn't directly control very much at all, but the commitments that nations make here and the joint markets and institutions that they create here create opportunities, but also, of course, sometimes regulatory burdens when they are implemented by national governments back home. The opportunity side can also lie in going along and showing to the world in what is, as well as a huge negotiation, one of the larger trade fairs effectively in the world, showing what your sector, what your nation, what your individual company is capable of in terms of transition. And it's not just the domain of businesses with a solution or a implementation in their own business that eliminates 100% of emissions. There are lots of case studies, including many gathered by the SB COP and made available to governments through this process, where businesses are, eking out 10% here, 15% there, improvements in the efficiency of their existing processes, anything from materials efficiency in the design of their products, which has multiple benefits, but where those materials are highly energy and emissions intensive to produce, you can wind up with a end product that is lighter and cheaper and also has a significantly reduced emissions footprint. So there's scope for a lot of positive storytelling here about what is working, as well as lessons learned on what isn't working. And we're seeing national policy announcements from other nations that are going to affect markets for Australia. And so two examples there. One, we've seen in the last couple of days that the Republic of Korea has announced they will transition out of coal-fired electricity generation entirely by 2040. That means we would expect no thermal coal exports from Australia to Korea over that by the end of that time frame, and a phase down of some sort through that time period. Obviously, some relevant implications for parts of the business community in Australia. The second is that fight we were talking about before about trade measures, unilateral or cross-border. The introduction of border adjustment mechanisms in Europe and the UK, potentially other economies, potentially Australia, will create opportunities as well as new costs. Because if you are cleaner than the average supplier of steel, say, into these markets with a border adjustment, you're likely to get actually more profitable than you are today in those markets. Now, of course, there is a sting in the tail for those who are falling behind the pace of their peers in decarbonisation. But the two biggest challenges that we face with industry decarbonisation are, one, can you find the money to invest in new kit? But two, is there a market somewhere that is going to pay the costs of the products made with the new kit? And border adjustment is controversial, but it's supplying one piece of that puzzle, the markets that will pay. The access to capital issue is still a big one.
Yeah. And so that's a very interesting announcement by Korea. And as you say, Australia can make its own decisions, but because we are a global player and supplier and customer, decisions made in other countries also have a dramatic impact on our own economy. But how does Australia fit in the global climate leadership puzzle? And we won't go down the rabbit hole of who's going to host the next COP, because that's, we haven't got another 30 minutes. But are we seen as a laggard or a leader? Are we, a responsible agent in terms of the negotiations? Where do we fit in?
So there are different opinions around the COP, because there are somewhere between 30 and 60,000 people here from a lot of different points of view. And so, of course, you can find trenchant critics of Australia, but you can also find a lot of respect for the role that Australia is playing. The emissions target for 2035 that Australia announced last month is pretty substantial. It's not the deepest emissions reduction target among developed economies, but it's pretty substantial, and it's quite well evidenced compared to the somewhat bare bones announcements that some countries make. As unsatisfied as we sometimes feel with the amount of consultation or the amount of evidence basis with Australian policy making, actually, we're pretty good compared to a lot of other major economies even. Within the negotiations, Australia leads, usually chairs what's called the umbrella group, which is the non-European Union developed countries. Everything at these negotiations is mediated through big groupings of nations to try and have the most coherence and impact. And Australia plays a strong role clubbing together with Japan, with Canada, with the New Zealanders, and in former times with the Americans, who are not at this COP, the official capacity at all. There is no representation of the United States of America federal government at this COP, which is quite odd.
Is the chamber there? US chamber?
Yes, the US chamber is there. States are here. Congressional delegations are here. The governor of California was here making a splash briefly last week. But the national government of the states is nowhere to be seen. All the most experienced, long-standing US negotiators are here, but they're all in think tank land or NGO land or working for somebody else and contributing their experience into the process. So Australia plays a constructive role in all that. We have had controversies over the decades, but we won't go deeply into the bid, but Australia has built quite a bit of credibility. I think the question marks that other countries have about us are we're, in any given year, the world's second or third largest exporter of fossil fuels. This process here does not focus on export of fossil fuels. It is about the production of emissions where those fuels are consumed. But nonetheless, a lot of countries cock an eyebrow at us and say, what's all that about? And Australia defends the position, when it has to, that the transition decisions there are for the countries that buy our fossil fuels. And then other things, of course, that come up are what contribution are we making to decarbonisation overseas? We're probably not going to link our domestic carbon market, the safeguard mechanism, with carbon credits from overseas. There's a lot of sensitivity to that in the federal government. But could we support, as Japan supports through its bilateral offset crediting mechanism, the reduction in emissions in Southeast Asia or the Pacific, and trade for some of those reductions to be credited against Australia's national target, which is a tough target. So we will see if Australia does host next year, which is, I would say, still the most likely outcome, but it will go down to the wire. One of the things we can expect to be the recipient of some pressure on is what we will do to support our region more, whether that is through trade and commerce, through government-to-government activity, or through linking markets.
Well, and I know we make a joke of this, but Australia's coffee diplomacy, I think, is key.
It's potent.
At these, I mean, these things are like B20 a bit of a circus that moves around the world. But what is one constant is Australia's outreach through coffee and the flat white.
That's right. The pavilion that Australia maintains at these COPs and has since the Glasgow summit in 2021, that is a really powerful tool of soft power and an amazing place for coordinating Australian business, Australian civil society and government's activities here at COP. And the thing that it is best known for is offering the best coffee at COP. Now, there were people who suspected that in Brazil, of all places, we would not be able to maintain that title of having the best coffee. I've got to say, I am told by a legion of coffee drinkers that we do maintain that title, because while there is, as they say, an awful lot of coffee in Brazil, the local baristas are not quite up to Sydney or Melbourne standards.
No, and it's the roasting. It's not the growing that counts. It's the roasting. Anyway.
Indeed.
Better not get off on a tangent of coffee. I think that's all we've got time for. Thanks very much, Tennant. You better get back to whatever it is that you're going to do now. I think it's night time now. You're probably going out for dinner.
It is night time. At the presidency consultation I was at earlier in the day, the presidency asked all the delegates, this is the parties, the nations, not us observers, asked them to all not leave the conference centre until midnight because of the discussions that are needed to be had in order to close the main items tomorrow. So I'm going to have a good night's sleep, but the delegates, not so much.
Oh, well, good luck to them. Thanks very much, Tennant. And that is all we've got time for. My name's Louise McGrath. And if you've got any comments or questions, please email us at industry.policy@argroup.com.au and we'll speak in a couple of weeks. Thanks.